How much can you learn about swimming, women's artistic gymnastics, and the Olympics from this romance novel? Well, that's what we're gonna find out today. If you're new to my channel, hey, I'm Marissa, and I make sports a little bit more accessible and fun without all of the condescension and gatekeeping that we can sometimes find in these fandoms. And one of the ways that I do that is by reviewing sports romance novels. But I review them a little bit differently than your typical review. Rather than just telling you whether I liked them or didn't like them, I read these books and tell you a couple of things. 1, how much of the sport would you learn just from reading the book? 2, how accurate is that information? And 3, does the book portray the sport in a way that makes it exciting enough to want to watch it after you close the cover? The last book I did in this series was called Throttled by Lauren Asher, and we broke everything down in the way that it related to Formula One. But because the Olympics are on and because I love the Olympics, I knew I wanted to do something that was like Olympic themed. And to be honest with you, I was shocked when I was looking for a book to see how few publishers actually had one coming out to celebrate this year's Olympics. It feels like every romance publisher should have had something slated to come out in July. I mean, the Olympics are just like such a perfect setting ground for a romance novel. We have the Olympic Village, we have elite athletes, we have rivalries, we have enemies, we have gold medals. I don't know, to me, we always hear so much about the Olympic Village being this like place for flirting and romance, you know, on top of all of the Olympic behavior that they're actually doing. And it just seems wild to me that so many publishers did not capitalize on this year. Because when I was searching for an Olympics book to review for this series, I found so many Winter Olympics ones. And I know that a lot of that is because hockey specifically is such a dominant pillar in the sports romance genre. But to be honest, I love the Summer Olympics. I love the Winter Olympics. I love the Olympics, actually. Anyway, it was hard to find one, but I finally did, and it was one that came out in July. The book is called Starting Line, and it is available on Kindle Unlimited. I actually finally found the book because someone else on TikTok was also hunting down an Olympic romance book, and this one was recommended a few times in the comments. So just our starting stats. This book takes place in the current Olympics, but instead of setting them in Paris, they actually set the games in Barcelona. And the sports that this book covers are swimming and women's artistic gymnastics. And as always, let's start with our key players. Our female main character is named TJ Brenner. She is an Olympic gymnast, and this is her second time going to the games, and she's already won multiple Olympic medals. Her specialty is beam, and because she went to the Olympics at 17, she has been dubbed America's Golden Girl. On the flip side, our male main character is Caleb Callahan. He is literally called America's Bad Boy, the one everyone loves to hate, and of course also a gold medalist. This book is following Caleb's third Olympic Games and TJ's second, and to run through the tropes that are kind of promised by the summary, we've got enemies to lovers, forced proximity, and friends with benefits. But when we're talking about how much this book actually covers the Olympics, what I would say is they actually don't get to the Olympics proper until about 70% of the way through the book. I was a little disappointed when I started reading to realize that that was going to be the case, because to be honest, what I have really been craving is like an Olympic romance that starts at Olympic Village. Like, take me through the meet cute, let me live through the 2 weeks of the Olympics. But I will say I liked the way that this was set up originally, because Caleb and TJ meet because they are both going to be the subjects of a documentary series following athletes on their way to the Olympics. This was kind of cool because there are a lot of series that are doing that right now. We've got Sprint on Netflix, which was produced by Box to Box Films. They also do Drive to Survive, if you're familiar with that. And they followed a bunch of the Olympic sprinters who are going to be heading to the Olympics this year, showing kind of their background, their journey, their training methods, and it's pretty cool. And the other one that I highly recommend is actually the one that Simone Biles is doing. That one's also on Netflix, and it starts at the Tokyo Olympics and then follows her path as she moves through her training and heading into the Olympics and qualifying for them. And then they actually are with her at the Olympics this year, so they're going to release more episodes after that. Obviously, a slight detour from the book itself, but the thing I liked about the setup was the fact that this is something that we are seeing become more and more popular. And so there was like a touch of interesting realism there, but I will get to my nitpicky things about that later. But when it comes to the sports, the first question I always like to ask with these is how important was the sport to the romance? Could these two people have fallen in love if it weren't for the sport itself? Answer, no, they definitely couldn't have. So much of this book is about them kind of supporting each other through their Olympic journeys, deciding what they want to do after the Olympics. There's a bit of that caretaker energy when we talk about kind of injuries or things like that. And the whole reason they start kind of being romantic with each other is that classic trope where they need to release some steam to remain competitive. So the sport itself and their Olympic journeys are definitely like crucial to them getting together, and it's certainly a large portion of the plot as we move through the book. Forced proximity also comes into place because they live in the same apartment building. I thought this was interesting because it seemed a little odd that they had never run into each other before. Gymnasts, especially at an elite level, would be training at the same gym they've been training at for a while, especially because gymnasts who show the type of promise that it takes to get to the Olympics oftentimes have to move to a different town in order to train at that gym. And the same thing can be said for swimmers. So it seemed a little odd to me that they would both be living in a smaller Midwestern town and never have run into each other or even been aware that the other person was training in that location. But that's definitely a nitpicky situation. I mean, you could always chalk it up to the idea that they both had very separate lives, they were both very driven in their training, and there was no reason for them to cross paths before they started living in the same building. Still, it was definitely something that kind of raised an eyebrow for me when it comes to the reality of these athletes' lives, but it's certainly one that we can get past. The next question that we ask is how much of the sport is actually shown? And the answer to that is that I would categorize this in the same way that we sometimes categorize the spicy scenes. While it's not a fade to black romance when it comes to that, it is what I would call a fade to black sports romance when it comes to the sport itself. There are very few scenes where you're actually with the athlete competing. We don't get a lot of mindset of being in the water for Caleb or being in competition performing a skill for TJ. Through the documentary and through a podcast that is sort of a runner throughout the book, we do get a lot of people talking about the way that they perform, but this isn't a book that's going to give you a feeling of that like on the page being with an athlete competing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially because this book is written in first person dual perspective. So the hard thing about writing a sports romance and putting it in first person perspective is that those characters have to be experts when they're talking about their sport. They have to use the right language, they have to know what they're talking about, and they have to also be careful about the way they're explaining things, because it does break the reality if in someone's internal monologue they're trying to explain how to do a skill when you know that that character should know everything about how to do it. So in terms of like what you would know about both of these sports going in, the plot does follow sort of the run up to qualifying for the Olympics. So a lot of people kind of jump into the Olympics when the Olympics start and don't know a lot about the competitions that come before that and qualifying and what the year leading up to the Olympics looks like. I wouldn't say that this book goes into great detail of that, but you do get a sort of montagey background version of it. We do know that Olympic trials happen, though again, in these scenes with both gymnastics and swimming, I would say they're sort of fade to black. You're aware that they're heading to the competition, you're aware that they are stressed about the competition, you get up to the point where they go to the competition, and then you sort of find out the results after you skip ahead. And then this is not necessarily a sports related accuracy situation, but one thing I do want to talk about is the way that the documentary is done. Because if you didn't know, before I started making sports content, I worked in film and TV. And the one thing that was kind of hard to read was the way that the documentary was done. You have basically the documentary filmmaker, Kate, and one cameraman, Shep, who is very much just sort of there to be there. He doesn't talk a lot or really affect the plot in big ways. And the thing that was kind of hard is, one, there would be a lot more people on the crew. Two, even though Caleb and TJ are never on camera together, a lot of their interactions come from these filming days. And then three, the way that the questions are done, Kate would have to basically be consistently present in the documentary itself for it to make any sense. Just like a little fun fact, if you've ever watched a documentary, one of the reasons why you never hear them asking the questions is because documentary subjects are told to basically rephrase the question inside their answer. So right now, if someone was asking me questions as a documentarian and they said, what was your favorite part about the book? I wouldn't just say my favorite part about the book. I would say my favorite part about the book was, so that they can cut out themselves speaking. Ideally, in a documentary, you want the documentarian to be as removed as possible, though obviously sometimes people break that rule. But this was basically a documentary that would not be possible to watch unless you actually kept every part of the documentarian in it. That's just a nitpicky thing for me. It has nothing to do with sports. And those documentary sections do give you the ability to get a little bit more one-on-one contact with these athletes, talking about their athletics and a lot of backstory. There's a lot of exposition done in them. They're obviously necessary. Next portion of the review is how accurately is the sport being depicted? And the answer to that is unfortunately not super. For the first portion of the book, honestly, we get so much of that fade to black that it actually isn't incorrect. It's just not very detailed. There are some things that are accurate, like the way that the Olympic trials happen, the apparatuses that women compete on in gymnastics, so vault, floor, uneven bars, and beam. The idea that TJ as a gymnast has one event that she performs particularly well on, being beam, that's also definitely accurate. Most elite gymnasts have one specific event that they compete the best on. If you're someone like Simone Biles, you compete the best on almost everything except for uneven bars. So this idea that TJ is specifically good at beam is definitely accurate. And then on the swimming side, one thing that is accurate, but I wish had been described in a little bit more detail, is the idea of how many different events there are in swimming. Swimming has multiple strokes, and then those events are also broken down by different meter lengths. So someone that swims like a 50 or 100 meter race, that's going to be your very fast sprint level swimmer. And then someone who competes in the 800 or the 1500 meter, that's an endurance swimmer. Caleb is an endurance swimmer and swims the 800 and the 1500, but that's not something that's necessarily stated until you get further into the book. It's something that's there as a seed of an idea, but something that actually would have been interesting to know about him going in, because someone who dedicates their entire life to being very quick for very short periods of time versus someone who's dedicating their training to being an endurance athlete, I think that's like a different type of person, a different type of athlete, and it's also certainly a different type of training. So we get a lot of these scenes of Caleb like in the pool and very focused on the idea of beating his dad's record, but we don't get a lot of like specifics when it comes to his training. Same with TJ, we just get the idea that she is training and that things are consistently hampered by an injury. And with Caleb, we just get the fact that he is training and that he's consistently struggling to beat his father's record. So not necessarily inaccurate, but just not very detailed. The inaccuracies definitely come when we get to the Olympics. And if you're trying to avoid spoilers in this review, this is the part where I am going to spoil a couple of things. I actually find with sports romance books, it's almost impossible not to have a moment where you are probably a little bit inaccurate, just because that's the same thing that happens with movies, with TV shows. In order to move a plot forward and have conflict, sometimes you have to cut a couple of corners in terms of like the actual amount of time things would take to plan out. Sometimes you have to speed a couple of things up when it comes to like timeline, or fudge certain facts to make things accurate to the way that you want things to move forward. But I do struggle when the inaccuracy itself is something that is required for the plot to move forward and is like a large moment to the romance, because it's something that wouldn't happen. And so that like immediate thing that's telling you, oh, this is wrong, makes it a little hard for me to buy into the romance itself. And that unfortunately is the case in this book. When they do make it to the Olympics, the big thing that happens is that TJ falls off the beam. First of all, when she's doing her beam routine, there are little inaccuracies that felt like a weird thing not to get right. Like she describes the beam as wooden, which it wouldn't be. There's wood utilized in making a balance beam, but it's also aluminum and covered. So the idea of like identifying it as a wooden balance beam is a little odd, especially at something as high profile as the Olympics. And then she does fall off, which does happen. She's rushed to the hospital, and that's obviously not great. But Caleb's first swimming event, the 800 meter, is happening at the same time. And this is where things start to fall apart, because for some reason, Caleb is in the lobby just around a number of regular fans moments before he's set to compete in this race. If you've watched the Olympics, you've seen that athletes are put in holding rooms, they're put in holding areas, they need to warm up. They are very much locked in for a period of time prior to their event. They have to check in, they have to warm up. A lot of them have rituals. Caleb even has rituals. And also they're like announced and they enter and go to their lane, and it's a whole big fanfare. So the idea that Caleb moments before the race would just be like in the lobby watching TV around a bunch of fans that would definitely be there to see him, recognize him, could have mobbed him. It's already this thing where you're like, what is going on? Obviously it's done so that he can actually see that TJ falls off the beam. And then we get into this grand romantic gesture situation. Because he doesn't want to swim, he demands to be able to leave, and his coach forces him to get into the pool. And then he swims the fastest race he's ever swam. And that's fine. Love the idea of him loving her so much that he needs to get to her, that he swims so much faster than he ever could. The problem that we have here is the fact that he then jumps out of the pool before the race is over. He's now secured gold, and jumping out of the pool when he does would literally be an automatic disqualification. And he's then pushing through news reporters and cameras that wouldn't have been granted access in that way, and he leaves before the medal ceremony. This for me was the point where I was just like pulled completely out of it. He wins a gold medal, he then jumps out of the pool, would have been disqualified. I honestly think this grand gesture would have worked a lot better if for some reason he had been notified about her incident and then had just like pulled out of the race. Determined that an Olympic gold medal was not as important as being with her, totally fine. But actually competing in the race and then doing something that would have disqualified him was like the part where I did get pulled out of the book. In terms of the sport itself, I honestly think the book was better depicted for the first 70% of it, where we're getting those kind of fade to black situations, tossed away lines, learning little things about the sport and the way their dynamic works, and also getting this idea of two athletes like supporting each other even though they don't understand each other's sports. All of that was actually pretty nice and utilizes the sports in a really good way, especially like the life of being an athlete. But once we get into the Olympics, the depiction of the sports themselves really do take a lot of liberties that then make it hard to follow, or at least hard to buy into. So would you learn a lot about swimming and gymnastics from this book? Sort of, yes. I think you get this idea that there are distance and endurance swimmers, and the idea that they're not competing against like shorter length swimmers. There's one person that Caleb interacts with a couple of times that's another swimmer that competes in shorter length distances, and we get this idea that they're able to be friendly because they're never competing directly against each other. So that tells you a little bit about the variation inside the sport itself. But when we get into the actual technical depiction of things, obviously, as I've mentioned, there are a few things that they do get wrong. In terms of gymnastics, it's pretty much the same, though again, in competition, there are a couple of things that are left out, like the fact that gymnasts actually get a chance to warm up before they go on to compete. This throws you right into the vault, to the beam, and those types of things. But again, that's not necessarily the biggest deal. As soon as you started watching gymnastics, you would realize that they get a chance to warm up, and it's not necessarily something you need to see them do in this book. Though given that her falling off the beam is actually like a specific plot point, maybe seeing warm-ups could have helped understand how that happens. In terms of high scoring elements for this, I thought the romance between the two of them made sense. It was easy banter, it was fun. Small deduction for the fact that I would not actually call this an enemies to lovers romance. Though to be fair, in the subtitle itself, it says forced proximity and friends with benefits. Enemies to lovers was just kind of clear in the summary and also in the setup, but it's very quickly dropped. The other thing I think is really good about this book is that it does explore the idea of mental health and being an athlete and having a chance to have a life outside of being an athlete. It's an easy read up until they get to the Olympics, and it is fun. Deductions for me are twofold. I've already talked about this sort of like sports inaccuracies, but the other big deduction for me was unfortunately there are quite a few like grammatical and spelling mistakes, and also one place where like a whole half of a sentence is just not printed. It seems like it might have just been rushed through its last copy edit in order to like get it out in time for the Olympics. But for me, it definitely did take me out of scenes where there were typos. The setup and the romance itself is realistic, and these two characters definitely needed the sports that they're competing in order to fall in love. Would I recommend this book if you are trying to actually learn a lot about gymnastics or swimming? Not necessarily, but if you're looking for an easy, fun Olympic read, especially if you like the tropes that I've mentioned, then this one's definitely fine to pick up. And do I think it would make you want to watch gymnastics or swimming? Maybe. It definitely makes the idea of falling in love with a swimmer sound fun, but I'm not sure that it like really depicts the sport in a way that I'm like, ooh, I want to go watch that. For me, this one's kind of middle of the road in terms of getting you into the sport. So that's pretty much my review of this book. Definitely some things I would have changed about it, definitely some inaccuracies, but overall, definitely a fine enough read. But obviously, romance reviews always come down to taste. So if you do read this one, I would love for you to leave a comment and let me know what you think about it. And if you weren't a fan of gymnastics or swimming, let me know if this book made you want to be. Anyways, that's pretty much all I have for this one. I will definitely be reviewing more, so if there's a particular sport or particular romance novel you'd like me to cover, feel free to leave that in the comments. And if you had a good time and you want to learn more about sports in a way that is fun and not condescending, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.